Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is a rainy and gross day here. It's Monday night, but I was really lucky. I got a last minute ticket to an event going on at a local brewery called Town Brewing, and they're having a little mech deck party tonight. So I'm excited to take you along. Let's go check this party out. Julie from the future. The event did sell out. I was really lucky to be able to be here at all, but I definitely did not have a seat where I could film very well. So actually what I just took was a bunch of audio recordings. So you may want to listen to this video kind of like a podcast because I don't have much video to put with the audio recordings. There were just so many people in front of me and I couldn't really film.
The battles of Lexington and Concord. Concord. Charlotte's leaders drafted overnight at Jack's Tavern and read the following day, May 20th, 1775, from the steps of Charlotte's first courthouse. It's been a treasonous document, a reason for a state holiday the day out of school, a hoax, subject of hot revolutionary scholarly debate, a state flag, a license plate, and a really, really great story, providing a window into life and times of Charlotte on the eve of the Revolution. Tonight we have gathered here to learn more about the mech deck's history and the society that produced it, as well as reflect on what it has meant and what it could mean for the Queen City going forward.
Pre-Prohibition American lager. So we wanted to make this as true to the time period as when this was happening as possible. So this is brewed with the grains that would have been available at the time. This beer is grown with 100% grain, grown here in North Carolina, just about 40 miles up the road in Rowan County, North Carolina, where I'm actually a 9th generation Brewing County, North Carolina. So my family would have been around at the time of this happening in the same area where this beer came from. So we're really happy. I'm through the moon to be able to bring this to you. A little bit of malted Pilsner barley and corn in here as well. We're Carolina grown corn, so that's where you'll feel some of that silky sweetness. But there are only a few times where it's applicable to give the North Carolina toast. So if you guys don't mind, if you'd all raise a glass here, I'd like to give the toast to our great state. And I'm going to read it so that I don't butcher it because this is on camera. So, here's to the land of the long leaf pine, the summer land where the sun does shine, where the wheat grows strong and the strong go great. Here's to down home, the old North State. Here's to the land of cotton bloom white, where the scuppernong perfumes the breeze at night, where the soft southern moss and jasmine mate, neath the murmuring pines of the old North State. Here's to the land where the galax grows, where the rhododendron roseate glows, where the stores Mount Mitchell summit great, and the land of the sky in the old North State. Here's to the land where maidens are fair, where friends are true and cold hearts rare. Near the land, dear the land, whatever fate, the blessed land, the Bethland, the old North State.
As far as you're concerned. And why is there a debate about
Well, first of all, thank you, Town Brewery, for doing this. This is a great thing. On April 19th, the battles of Lexington and Concord occur. A month later, a rider comes to North Carolina where there's a meeting taking place in the law courthouse downtown and tells them that what has occurred, and they go ballistic. And then you have this document produced that we call the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, declaring Mecklenburg County free and independent of Great Britain. And that's an interesting, local curiosity story that's fun and full of facts and so forth. The more interesting to your question for me is all of the ripples that the story then throws out over the next 250 years, from presidential visits to presidential debates on its veracity to all these kooky little pieces of evidence that float around, and names on gravestones and the mech deck on gravestones and local legends. So the ultimate local legend story.
Research in order to honor the men who made this place the cradle of independence. My God, we have shown belief and support for the Charlotte Hornets for 30 years. Can we please support these Patriots by spending 5 minutes to learn the story?
That is perfect. I'm a new native, so arrived 3 years ago, something like that. And on the first day, I opened up the paper and there was this amazing story. And so my view of this entire story is that for this community, this is a treasure.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable, and the historical backing is great. And when I read that there was controversy, I thought, well, how? We know the results happened. We have all those printed in all the newspapers all along the coast where he went. He dropped them off, and we know them. They're printed. You can see them. You can hold them. So it has to be. So but the results were B. You have to go from A to B first. And A was, they're out of here. We're making a decision. We're doing it. So you can't get to B without A, no matter what. So from the very beginning, I was just totally sold in this fun story, and I'm delighted to have been a part of it.
Yes. I'm going to jump in again and say, I want to just piggyback on that. I always think of it as, what a shame. How many towns would kill to have an origin story where they're the cradle of American independence? I mean, it's like, and I say this at every event, but it would be like being in Boston and having to remind people that the Boston Tea Party actually happened.
Right.
So
And having to defend it.
Yeah, and people saying, no, that's a hoax. And so I think one of the things that's so great about town and the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and May 20th is maybe finally Charlotte will sort of embrace this incredible backstory.
So why are we even talking about a controversy? How did it get started? Why was it a problem to begin with?
Jefferson. There's a lot of levels to that. Well, the simple answer is the original papers are gone in a fire in April of 1800 in the participant's house at John Bingham Alexander's home. And they're gone, and they'll never be recovered, and that's just a fact. But that's okay. The papers are missing, so if you are, as we call them, a hater or a skeptic, and you want to be one of those actually people, then you say, well, actually, you don't have that piece of paper. Well, so what, right? There's lots of historical events that are perfectly well documented. You may not have the one piece of paper, but you have eyewitnesses, you have corroborated testimony, you have other papers, you have historical circumstances, you have circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial is very good evidence, too. So that's why we, as an evidentiary matter, have a controversy. We also have a controversy because there's this bizarre, and David Wright speaks about this a lot, this is a bizarre set of folks in the community, and in North Carolina specifically, who just don't like this story for some reason. And just viscerally, and you can't win them over with logic or books or arguments. They're not in for it, and it's just, I don't know if it's emotional or psychological.
It's a weird form of self-loathing. I did, this obviously is my favorite event I've ever done. But one of the biggest events I've done was in Richmond, Virginia, at the Virginia Museum of History. And the joke starting there was, oh, do I need a bodyguard? Those people embraced and were curious and did the research, and they were all in on the Met Day. And then you come home and someone goes, and a reporter just the other day goes, yeah, but sorry, some people think it didn't happen. And I'm just like, I can't do it.
Well, welcome to my life.
Let's keep going with that. So we've got people now that understand, and some that don't want to believe. But we've got 249 years, since 1776. So what all has gone on since then? How far back is this controversy?
Well, without getting too much in the weeds, the controversy has ground on for a long time, let's put it that way. And it ground on in about the 1820 period when various states are all claiming that they get the primacy and credit for the American Revolution. The Virginians are like, this is a story of Virginia and Yorktown, and the people of Massachusetts are no, this is a story of Sam Adams, the Boston Tea Party. And then some local patriots here said, well, actually, if you were paying attention, Mecklenburg County in our small state of North Carolina declared independence way before anybody else. And the rest of the country, as I did myself 200-something years later, said, you're making this up. I've never heard of this in my life. how is this possibly true? And so it's gone through so many variations of Jefferson and Adams debating about it, which is fun. Other historians getting involved, other historians destroying some of the evidence, and maybe some Jefferson people doing the same. There's a lot of conspiratorial type stories intertwined with this, which really kind of makes it really the fun of the story for me is a bit of that. When we started the May 20th Society, this was not a subject you really talked about in polite society very much. People were like, why are we talking about this ridiculous thing that no one cares about? And it's a complete hoax. And so when I started doing research, it was astonishing to me how much evidence there really was. Right. Now you couldn't find the one thing that would solve it for everybody's satisfaction. But there's 330 pages of evidence, in my book and so we were trying to just get the needle moved from this is idiotic, don't talk about it, back into the middle where it really ought to be, which is there's a great body of evidence, people can argue for and against, but you can't just kind of glibly dismiss it as an urban legend with no support, because that's just ignorant.
Right. That's a good, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I too started the project as a skeptic. And the book was going to be sort of tongue-in-cheek, haha, look at these crazy people. And then you start to, again, 5 minutes into the research, you're like, oh my God, this actually happened. Right. And I think it was the governor of North Carolina, when North Carolina did an investigation to respond to Virginia's claims that this was a hoax. They did a thorough investigation that included 13 of the most amazing top-tier eyewitnesses. And when they published that, I love what the North Carolina governor said, and I'm going to botch it, but to paraphrase it, it's that the MEC deck was the most proven piece of the entire Revolutionary War, because that's how deeply they dug into that. And I will add, because the thing I don't mind talking about the controversy, it really has helped keep it alive, but we focus on that, we miss talking about these incredible, brave, this amazing community, the patriots that decided to do this and risk their own lives. Sometimes it overshadows that. But I always say, gosh, how do we, on the flat earther MECDEC side, we've got, we've got a crappy Wikipedia page from an anonymous editor. And on our side, all we have are 11 US presidents, the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. We've got 2 Moravian documents plus a Moravian scholar. We have 13 eyewitnesses from people who were military veterans, historians, priests. It's pretty easy to combat.
Yes.
I'll ask Chaz. So you move in historical circles outside of this region probably much more than anybody here, including the things like the White House rooms this week. That's another story. What kind of reception do you get from people, or does this come up, or when you talk about it, what's people's reaction, if any?
I mean, for everyone, these are people outside North Carolina, they haven't heard of it, and they're wait, this is the greatest. And it doesn't take long just to figure out that, we think, okay, we don't have the document in hand. They didn't make many copies. It wasn't a thing you wanted to do.
Right.
I mean, if your name was on that and it was the loss, you're gone. So their lives depended on the fact that there were few copies. So that's the beginning. So of course, they didn't have many copies. Once we think of the Declaration of Independence, those are all the printed copies. They're everywhere. They printed tons of them after the fact. So it's the miscomparison that happens all the time. But that's the main thing for me, is just that there's so much historical fact around this stuff that it's so hard to think otherwise. But that's me at this point. I'm very much deep in the weeds.
I just want to mention too, it's unfair that nobody talked about the Jefferson's Declaration of Independence until 1819 or so, when as a country we could exhale and go, oh my God, this experiment is actually going to work. So it's unfair for people, especially out of North Carolina, to hold the MECDEC to a higher standard that, well, how come nobody talked about it? How come nobody printed something or read about it? It was like, well, nobody talked about either declaration for 50 years. So that is another thing the sort of flat earthers bring up. and it's an easy thing to get around.
Well, I like that you're bringing up the context of the document itself. You know, let's look at it within its own time period instead of from ours. But then we have Chaz with us, who is tasked with making this amazing statue of Captain Jack. As a Charlottean, you know, I absolutely love. I'm sure many of you do as well. So please tell us about your process about learning about him, creating him for our city.
Let's see, well, you know, in creating a monument like this, all you're doing is telling a story. And, you know, in this case, well, let's see, in some cases, you can have actual visual references of the person, you can dig up who they were exactly, you can see what they look like, you can sort of, you've got this whole tier of things you can do. But with Captain Jack, because of the beauty of Captain Jack, he was just an ordinary guy. So there were no portraits of him, there's nothing remnant of him. We don't know what he looked like. So the true answer in terms of the likeness and the capturing Captain Jack, that was purely invented. But in parentheses, I should note that when we unveiled it, huge gathering, descendants came from all over the place, tons from Texas and tons from California. And there was a guy who showed up with long hair, you remember, with long hair, and he stood next to the statue and he looked just like the So I was given credit for that, but there was no credit to me.
Yeah, we can tell the story quickly. I wanted to point out too that you had not done a horse or animal sculpture right before Captain Jack, so you had to study equine physiology before you started doing that statue.
Yeah, well, you know, so telling the story, and you only have so much. You know, the guy took a document, he took it up to Philadelphia, he took it on a horse. And it's an exciting moment, and there's energy in that. And you got motion and movement, so I'm thinking movement, energy, you know, excitement, and then you realize that's all on the horse. And I had never sculpted a horse, so I went, you know, I had to learn, and I found some documents, and there were these great engravings, and anatomy engravings, and they were so visually great that I could really understand them. And those are the ones I used. And now again, in parentheses, jump forward a bunch of years, I actually paid attention to these things now. I have the big prints on my wall forever. But I looked at the fine print that says the origin of the print. It was by Stubbs, and he's English, so it's an English print, and the date was 1775.
I'll just add too, when we unveiled the Captain Jack statue as the first statue in the Trail of History in May of 2010, I believe it was. And we did an outreach program to descendants of the story, right, of the signers. And we had, I think it was 500 Jack descendants from around the country come to Charlotte for this event. Well, I still get emails from these folks all the time. I mean, there's a huge, also what was astonishing me learning about the story years and years ago, how many people lived here are direct descendants of these people. So this isn't an abstract little historical hoax story for them. It's like it's real life and it's important family legacy. And you have Captain Jack DAR chapters in Texas and California and all the rest of the country. Going back to it gets celebrated everywhere in here sometimes. Right?
And for people who are doubting the importance of public art or for statues like this iconic work, that I was there at the unveiling, and that is, Scott likes to say, that's when I was radicalized as a neck decker. But that's when it really became emotional, and I became obsessed with learning more about the story because of the piece that you did, and really just how incredible it is. And I also, you've got to tell the story about your challenge with the horse's backside. Okay, so when we met to talk about it for the book, I love the fact that you were like, one of the greatest challenges I had as an artist was we want Jack to be facing north because he's charging up to Philadelphia, and so the biggest challenge for the artist was we had to do it in a way that wouldn't just have 3 lanes of traffic staring at a horse's behind.
Always looking to be accurate, right? There was the one location where it was going to go, so that was a given. But now, you know, how do you have this horse turning north if he's facing the way he's facing, or the way the line of sights are from the various red lights. And that was the hardest part. So coming up with a turning as opposed to a turned, but a turning pose is the one that worked. It meant that the backside view would only be for those actually in motion and not parked, sitting at the back. But yeah, no, see, there are other little anecdotes have nothing to do with anything with the size of the horse this evening. And we had a deadline, and I'm in the metal shop, and it's late at night, and there are some guys working with me. And I arrive, and we have the body put together, and it's tacked together, so that means it's got big gaps where you haven't filled in with the weld. And there's a guy, and I'm in this dark room, it's late at night, and there's a light flashing, and the light's flashing from the corpse, from the core of the horse, inside and out. And it's flashing through the dust, so it looks like something that Spielberg would make. Amazing view, and then I realize it's a guy with a welding torch inside the belly. You need to the size. That's what it's really.
Well, I really love the name of it, the Spirit of Mecklenburg.
Yep.
And I would like for you all to comment on what was the Spirit of Mecklenburg then? Who were these historical actors that made the Meckdeck?
Well, so the county was populated by Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. And as I like to say, they're not just Presbyterians as we think about them today, nice collar-wearing, shirt-wearing people who play golf, but like devout, radical, like more Presbyterian than Presbyterian. They were kicked out of Pennsylvania for being too Presbyterian. The English authorities in the church, the Anglican church, hated them very much, and vice versa. So they had come to live here, the sort of last stop on the Great Wagon Road, to live in the woods so they could practice their religion and be left alone. And as more encroachment happened upon their rights, they were taxed to supporting churches, you had to have an English minister to get married and so forth. They were exactly the population that would have had a Meckdeck story. Like it couldn't have happened anywhere else. If it happened, it had to have happened here. And we know that also because not only in 1775 and all the stories around that, but when the British occupied Charlotte 5 years later, after sweeping through South Carolina and thinking we've won the war, basically. The war's over, we've taken Charleston, we've taken South Carolina, we just defeated the Americans at Camden. They arrive at sleepy little forested Charlotte and are immediately under siege by people hiding in the woods and shooting at them. And there's a great quote by Bannister Charlton, one of the British engineers, in his post-war memoirs, where he says, and this is the one that that's me actually when I was doing the research, but his quote was, "It had been frequently mentioned to the king's officers and was evident that the counties of Mecklenburg and Rouen were more hostile to England than any other in America." And I told Brandon, by the way, I said, Tarleton's Quarter has got to be the name of a beer at some point.
I think there was a perfect storm that happened in Charlotte in May of 1775 that created this document. And the more you learn about the history of the people who were populating Charlotte, the more you realize it would have been much stranger if these men and these families had not declared independence, knowing their background. And they were essentially kicked out of Scotland, kicked out of Ireland. They crossed an ocean. They were pushed all the way to the western part of Pennsylvania. They came all the way down through hostile Virginia. And they came to the Carolina frontier to get away from the king's tyranny. And these were people who, devout Presbyterians, who had always been taught that fighting against the tyranny of the king was the highest form of obedience to their God. So they were the first to be radicalized, and they were the ones who, it makes a lot of sense that they were the ones who were like, well, we're not going to mess around. We're gonna put it in writing, and let's start fighting. It's very clear that they were the first Americans to recognize, because of what had happened for generations to their families, they were the first to recognize this is not going to get better. This is what the king has been doing for centuries. It's not going to get better. Where's the Meckdeck? I want to sign, and I want to start fighting.
You mentioned the writing too. What fascinated me, there's the correspondence you see between Jefferson and Adams, where one's teasing the other about, wait, did someone else write something like this? And those letters you can find, it's great. But what hit me is the language similarity that we see, roughly, in the reconstructed deck from the people who were there. And you wonder, well, is that just because it was copied later? But you find out that that people who were here in Charlotte were educated at what is now Princeton. And they contributed to the writing of this. And so the same kind of scholarly writing of the time, the legalese of the time, was what's evident in the words that you see that sound so reminiscent of the Declaration of Philadelphia.
That's such a good point, because again, what we're doing is we're arming you with ammunition to be the MECDEC army, to sort of to change the narrative. But one of the more famous MECDEC flat earthers was a professor at UNC in Chapel Hill, and his big argument was, what would these farmers and frontiersmen on the colonial frontier of Carolina, what would they know about high concepts like freedom and independence? And then it turns out the actual facts are the men who really crafted and debated and wrote the MECDEC were all Princeton scholars. Mic drop.
So is there anyone in particular that sticks out to you as the spirit of Mecklenburg 1775?
It's such a great cast story, and Captain Jack gets all the even though he was not a signatory to the document, strangely, but he's more or less the messenger service, but he gets a lot of the props because the story is so good with him, and rightly so. But Ephraim Brevard, who's one of the three who's credited with writing it, is a fascinating character at Princeton. Loses his eye as a child, volunteers to fight in the 1775-76 campaigns, is captured at the Siege of Charleston and put on the British prisoner of war ship in the harbor, which is not where you wanted to be in June of 1780 at all. And so everyone's getting malaria and yellow fever, and people are literally dying like flies. And he's allowed to leave and walks home from Charleston, where he dies at McNitt Alexander's house, aged 27, something like that. So he's that's somebody who have a statue in Charlotte, it seems to me. And not a lot of people know about him at all, and we don't know where he's buried, although extensively looked into the issue. So for me, he's kind of one of the unsung ones. But what do you think?
I was going to say too that he was released from duty and stayed to take care of the sick soldiers, and that's how he ended up getting sick and dying. For me, it's not a signer; it's General Joseph Graham. He's my favorite sort of MECDEC badass. Sorry, but he was one of the men. He was one of the men who defended Charlotte against Cornwallis and helped turn the tide of the entire Southern campaign of the Revolutionary War. I think that's something that gets overlooked, is that the spirit of Mecklenburg, the spirit of the MECDEC, actually leads to, you can draw a direct connection to, changing the entire course of the war and basically saving the Southern campaign because of the patriots and the bravery in Charlotte. At one point, we had even thought about naming my book, You're Welcome, America. Because again, people don't know about the MECDEC, and they don't know about North Carolina's role in the war. But General Joseph Graham was a hero in the Battle of Charlotte, was wounded 9 times, and survived that. This was the first place. He was part of a group outnumbered 15-1. Was the first part of the first group that made Cornwallis go backwards, and again changed the course of history. And he then becomes a MECDEC eyewitness, who again, the people who are the flat earthers, they have no answer for the eyewitnesses. We're not talking about people off the street that remembered it or had a. This is General Joseph Graham gave detailed sworn testimony about May 20th, 1775. And I always like to point out, so when you disparage or you make fun of the MECDEC, or you doubt it, or you call it a hoax, you are calling this original military veteran a liar. And yeah, it's that's why that needs to stop. See, radicalized. I'm still radicalized.
Mine is my greatest creation.
That's true.
Still going. When it comes to the Spirit of Mecklenburg and the Charlotte story, obviously I'm partial to Captain Jack. And I tried, and you always try to put yourself in their shoes, you try to envision what it's like to be at that time. And now the situation of the Mech Deck happens, and they've written this document, and then they go and sign this document. They're putting their name on this piece of paper. It's the most dangerous piece of paper for them from that moment onward. And then they got to get it to Philadelphia. You can't just send it. Who do you send it with? You got to send it with somebody. So you're literally putting your life in the hands of this one guy. So if you want to be the guy living in the town and be the most loved and trusted guy around, that's a pretty good spot to be. I mean, obviously it's not so good for him because he had to go all the way to Philadelphia and risk everything. But so that, for me, that just put him at a different level of respect and role in this story.
That's why he was the Spirit of Mecklenburg, right?
And when Cornwallis wanted to send a message because he hated Charlotte and again called it a damn hornet's nest of rebellion, the message he sent was he burned Captain Jack's home and tavern to the ground to send a message to the Mechdeckers.
And I believe killed his father in the process.
It led to the death of his dad. Yeah, that war crime.
One of many.
Is there anyone else, as we do have time, that you would want to point out in this story before you're asked by the audience? I, for one, want Lin-Manuel Miranda to write Alexander Craighead.
Craighead made a great story. That's another one which is ancillary to the overall specifics of Mecklenburg. He dies 10 years before this. But he was, as I talked about the Presbyterians, he was the leader of the Covenanter faction of the Presbyterians. And these folks would, preach with their swords, raise their swords over their heads. And many of them during the American Revolution, ministers went and fought. Took the muskets and went and fought. And Craighead was the personification of the area here. And he was more anti, and you read his sort of existing sermons, there's only a couple, and they're a great read. Where he's calling the kings of England the antichrists and the papists, and just goes on and on. And if he was any reflection of sort of the views of the people living here, it would have been him.
And he's an example of that perfect storm too, right? That happened in Charlotte, and the fact that this is where he was sort of on the run as well, from the sheriff in Virginia, from the presbytery in Pennsylvania, and he comes to Charlotte and essentially takes, for 10 years, indoctrinates the entire Carolina frontier in this thought that basically rebellion and revolution through religion. And he really is the one. The Charlotte Observer, I think at the bicentennial, said that he should have been the first person to sign the Mech Deck. He had died obviously 9 years earlier, but the Observer said that in essence, though, he really was the first signer of the Mech Deck.
He was the Spirit of Mecklenburg, yeah.
Yes.
If you get it, the story only makes sense if you understand Craighead and the people who lived here, and then it all kind of falls into place.
Yeah. The other thing too, just to give if we're closer, shifting gears here, before you forget though, if you think of the flow of history, the flow through time, and how governments were made, and how they were run, and from whom and by whom and to whom and on whom, and all that. There's this whole concept of allowing the individual to be the core for a governmental system. And that didn't exist anywhere. And that notion was floating, and it was something that's possible. And then the Courier comes in, and Lexington and Concord News hits Charlotte, and suddenly it all comes together in that perfect moment, where these guys think, well, geez, this may be our time. This is the time to try it. And without this first step, it would not have happened. And there's no other country in the world that's had the individual as the center of its ruling system. So it's incredible to think it happened just right here.
Yeah, and we, just the other day we were talking about sort of the setting and what happened actually in the courthouse on May 19th and May 20th. And one of the things that I forgot to mention, which is my favorite part, I mean, the free and independent part is the most important part of the MECDEN. But there was another phrase that Brevard added that I hope I won't botch, but essentially he was like, we are now, these signers and citizens of Mecklenburg, bound to one another now that we've declared independence. There's no backstop, there's no king, there's no government, we are bound to each other. And I always imagine that as, so not only did we be the first to declare independence, that really to me is like the first expression of American patriotism, right? We're all in this together. Forget about backgrounds, forget about everything else. We have to rely on each other.
Well, I do want to switch gears a little bit and go kind of to Charlotte now, and how we commemorate, celebrate, or don't here in Charlotte. That one off script. Do you maybe have any thoughts about the divide over the MECDEC in North Carolina today? Not just in Charlotte, but in the state of North Carolina. This history with crackhead and the president. That's valid, historically speaking. You have Craighead coming. You have these religious dissenters coming into an area away from the Anglican Church, whereas the coastal counties are settled by those folks. So do you think that is still influencing the acceptance or non-acceptance of this document?
That's a good point. It definitely has. It definitely has. It's a regionalism story too, right? Between the Virginians, where it started with the Virginians and the Massachusetts folks against the North Carolinians, but also internally between the North Carolinians in Mecklenburg and maybe those in Wake County or along the coast or so forth. But I still don't understand. Again, to go back where we started the organization 20 years ago, and got a relatively cool reception in many circles. That why, if you live in Charlotte, at least, you wouldn't be like, okay, it's controversial, whatever. I'm not too deep in the weeds on the story, but why wouldn't you be broadly in favor of it, right? Why would you default to the I'm against it? If you live here, it makes no sense to me. You could say, I don't know all the evidence either way, but if I've got to have an opinion, why would I be against it? But I can see why you would if you live in Virginia, right? If you're Jeffersonian, Monticello, or Richmond. But why we have not we, but certain parts of this area have had such a kind of self on this has always been. It's not over yet. We're the right way, I would say, but it's not over.
Don't you think this is also a bigger issue for a lot of different things in Charlotte? And definitely something that the town is going to have to deal with as more and more, as we are made up more and more of people who aren't from Charlotte. And I think, I always give this example, I grew up in Detroit. And so if somebody wants to argue about Original Six hockey teams, or Motown, or Chili Dogs, it's like, I'm in that argument right away, I'm invested. And so I think there is something, it doesn't have to be this way, but I think part of the makeup of Charlotte, as it becomes more and more people who aren't from here, you're not as eager to sort of jump up and defend your town if you're not from here. And I think that's easy to change, but I think that's part of the reason why people are so quick to sort of just not defend her.
I would just add too, as this project has grown over the years, what kind of counterintuitively, we find that a lot of people that are the new transplant people here love this story. Like they're all in on it. Like the OMB, you go to Old Mecklenburg or some of these other places, and you meet people, some of their bartenders are not from here, they knew nothing about it, but they're all in on it. It's a lot of the local North Carolina people that are the doubters, because, as I said many times, you get a lot of people from out of town, they move here, they're 26 years old, they're living in Noda or whatever, and they look around, they're like, what a city. It's obviously, 15 years old. And so, part of the history, they're like, oh my heavens, this is just amazing, without going down the rabbit hole of like, well, actually, we don't have the documents, so I'm not sure I can get involved, right? But those folks have really rekindled this whole story.
There's also, let's face it, there's a lot of haters in Raleigh. I mean, that's where a lot of it comes from, and which is bizarre to me as well. It's like we're all North Carolinians, but that's where the most pushback comes from. Strangely.
Well, I mean, are you all familiar with historian David McCullough?
Yes.
Right, well, for me, the bottom line is David McCullough loved and believed this story.
Nice.
So if he likes it, and Scott actually brought him to the McDeck at one point. Incredible to watch him just dive in, dig deep, and come out saying, yeah, this is good. So David McCullough says, yes, I'm in.
And not just McCullough, right? There's another thing that people say, oh, but no modern historians. It's like, no, David McCullough, Pulitzer Prize winning historian, Ken Burns, Cokie Roberts, Andrew Roberts, and even most recently, Sharon McMahon, who's known as America's government teacher, all in on the McDeck. So another counterpoint.
So what do you think it's going to take? What do you think it's going to take for Charlotte, Mecklenburg County? How do we build up this story as a bigger part of our identity, and maybe whether or not people in Raleigh or somewhere else take it seriously or not is no longer part of the story?
Well, I mean, just you see the people here tonight, like from where this was 20 years ago, which was basically more or less snuffed out or close to being snuffed out, to what we've experienced. David and I were on a McDeck bus tour yesterday for 56 people for 3 hours that sold out in like an hour. This event, this great venue.
All we do is sell out, Scott.
All we do. We just keep doing events and sort of institutionalizing this. And frankly, if we didn't have Chaz's wonderful statue as a part of the common visual remembrance, that would be a big disadvantage, because there's no buildings here, right, from that period. It's all, you have to imagine it, you have to believe in it. You can go to some cemeteries, but that doesn't really excite people that much, other than me. My kids really don't like it. But, so that's all you have. So when we were working on Chaz's statue and things like that, you're putting a marker down that people can't ignore, right? I mean, otherwise they can say, well, we really don't believe it, like, look at the statue. And it's on the state flag. It's on the state flag. I mean, what are we even debating? Right? Are we changing the flag? No. What does it mean? I don't know. I don't want to talk about it.
Both my wife, my 2 daughters, and my agent in New York have begged me to move on from the McDeck. But I can't, right? It's become, it means something now, beyond the book. Beyond, it means something. And I think what I've realized is it's going to happen through people, and it's good through things like this, right? The McDeck was a grassroots document where people said, I don't care what anybody else thinks, we're declaring independence. And so I always tell people, it's like, you are the McDeck army, right? All we need is to get enough people to know the story that you can stop people and correct them when they say, oh, that was a hoax, that's a folktale, that never happened. And it's literally a grassroots thing, one person by one person by one person. I truly believe that it'll happen.
So one last question from me, and then we'll open up to the audience. Do you see any lessons in the history of the McDeck for younger generations and civic engagement?
Yeah. There's the obvious is paying attention to what's happening around you for kids today. Just even in current events, you can find people are oblivious to some major things moving. And then it gets to the to history. It's just a collection of stories, but those stories are some serious power to them. So that is the main message, basically. Just simple.
I don't think I can top that. I do like the fact that there were social classes in 1775 in North Carolina, not as much as in Virginia or Pennsylvania. But one of the things that I love about the MECDEC is there were the men who did show up to that meeting on which started on May 19th. There were Princeton scholars, there were militia members, there were farmers, there were tavern owners. It was everybody was welcome and everybody was heard, and it was something that sort of united the whole community behind this document. And I think we can always use an example of that.
Hello, I'm David Charlton. I was at the bicentennial, so was she. Don't engage in heavy historic, discussions around history except through education and whatnot. I was just telling my husband, and I'm embarrassed to say, I've always thought it was factual. I never knew there was a controversy. I've never seen myself as somebody that needed to spread the word. I just thought that everybody knew that we did this a year ahead of everybody else because it was part of my education. And so I wonder, and I'm a little bit ashamed of that kind of apathy or lack of awareness of what's going on. And, I could make a lot of excuses, or I guess make them think they were reasons. I wonder how many people out there are like me.
Well, I think it did used to be part of the North Carolina curriculum, just a couple of paragraphs. And there is a movement, especially through the DAR, to get it reinserted into North Carolina curriculum. And I think whatever's happened in the past doesn't matter. It's sort of what we do and how we speak about it from here on out. I would love to know, were you at Freedom Park when President Ford? Wow, that's so cool. And were there really 100,000 people? All right, we got to get back to that.
I can't recall if y'all addressed this in your books, but I was wondering, were there other people? I know in Fayetteville they had the Liberty Point resolves, I think a little after these, and then the Halifax resolves up in Halifax. Were there other people, other communities that happened to after Mecklenburg in North Carolina?
Yeah, there were. It was a very common thing. There was Tryon resolves. There was for many years, and you could find them. Instead of that, it was everyone has resolve as a situation, but the only one that said usually these resolves that say something along the lines of, we are still loyal subjects to the king. However, we are not happy with Lord North and the ministry, therefore we need help with X, Y, and Z. So this was the reason this was significant. It's the only one that said we are free and independent and didn't engage in hedging their bets. But yeah, it was a very common thing at the time where the people in various counties or towns would pass a semi-anti-British resolution. After and before. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to tell you a little bit about why this is important. I'm a homework helper at the Allegra Westbridge Library, and I have a little third grader who was studying Lexington and Concord, and we started out, he couldn't understand the difference between a patriot and a loyalist. So we go through that, and then the next week his assignment is he's got to come up with like a quiz show. So we do the questions for the quiz show. And then the next week he comes back and he says, Mrs. Park, I got an A. And we clapped and we're happy. And I said, but it just didn't happen up there. And his eyes got real big. And I said, that statue of the horse? And he thought it was the other horse, the other rider from the Revolutionary. I said, no, that's Captain Jack. And there's the men deck. That means we did it a whole year before 1776. And his eyes got real big. And he spent the rest of the hour researching it. A third grader. So this stuff's really important.
I think another thing we need to start doing is we need to start referring to Paul Revere as the Captain Jack of the North.
This is just an observation. We've only been in Charlotte for 8 years, so this was coming here. This was new to us. We read both your book for our book club, and then we read David's book. But for someone who's raised in a very conservative religious environment, this whole thing that we're dealing with, to me, has elements of religion. Yeah. There's kind of a proof of concept. There's documents that may or may not exist. There's heretics. There's people that are advocating on both sides. So for me, it's almost like, and again, it was new because we've only been here for 8 years, but it's like being introduced to a new religion and seeing it debated as to whether you're a believer or a heretic or not.
Believer, heretic.
I have a follow-up question for Fleming. 2 parts. What were the basic motives of the mostly Scotch-Irish scientists back there? And then, when they did publish it, when they did sign it, what did they expect the outcome was going to be? What was next? What did they believe was going to happen?
That's a really good question, and I do think there was a sense of they sort of, the rider from Lexington and Concord comes in and gives them the news, and they're already in the courthouse, and there's already sort of, as we talked about, in this whole entire region, this sort of powder keg of wanting to fight, of sort of wanting to get on with it, and it was just sort of waiting for a spark. And it was that Lexington and Concord rider comes in, again, perfect storm. The 27 representatives from the different militias were already there and had already debated and at the Freedom Spring in Huntersville about should we go ahead and just formally declare independence. And so I think it was just a moment of, then they do go ahead and do it. And there's 2 things I love about the story is they were so new to something like this. When after Thomas Polk read the Mac Deck and everybody threw their hats up, they all landed on the courthouse roof. And so most of Charlotte spent the rest of the day, the first few hours of their independence, trying to get their hats off the roof. But there is, and I do think there was a real sense of the next morning, sort of like a hungover, like, oh my God, what did we do? Did we declare independence? And so what they did was they followed that up with the resolves, which were new rules and guidelines as to how they were going to govern themselves now that they were independent.
I also think that they were expecting, it's just like someone running into a field with a banner and expecting you to run with you. They went all the way to Philadelphia, and Captain Jack gets there, and he delivers this message, and Captain Jack's still on fire after all that time on the horse. He's just still rocking, and it's just at the perfectly wrong moment in terms of bad timing, because they were still waiting for the response from the king. They had sent this Continental Congress of Philadelphia had sent the last letter to the king, let's make a deal kind of thing. And what they didn't know, time-wise, because they didn't get the communication back, the king had already dismissed it. So he was totally right, and people there were ready to do it, but they just needed that last-ditch effort to make a deal, because there were some softer people in the crowd. So people here, they were resolved. They knew that what they wanted to do. They were sending that message to Philadelphia, let's just do it. And then it didn't move, because they were waiting to hear back from the king. So the immediacy didn't quite happen the way they had planned. But that, I'm sure, is what they were thinking. We're going.
Another scene I love is Captain Jack races into Philadelphia. They had just sent the olive branch letter to the king that basically said, we love you, we don't want to fight, we don't want to be independent, we want to be your loyal subjects. And then Captain Jack shows up with 4 documents that say, we're already independent. It's like, and they were like, dude, chill. And it's like, what is going on? It's like, what?
When Cornwallis and his army came through Charlotte, approximately how many citizens lived in Mecklenburg County? And a second question, did Captain Jack get any type of receipt or anything?
Scott should answer this because you are done with, I don't want to jinx it, but you are done with a Cornwallis book that hopefully will come out next year. Yep, and so you're the expert.
So then it's gonna be embarrassing. I don't really know the answer, but so Charlotte is when Cornwallis, Charlotte in the 1780. There are 10 or 20 log houses around what's the center of town now, plus the courthouse. But everyone has fled. They've taken all their animals and their horses and their cattle, and they've all been pushed north, and they're headed towards the mountains, fleeing the advancing British army. So with that, I think the entirety of the county at the beginning of the American Revolution was less than 1,000 people. So in the town itself, the British records and Cornwallis' letters in the period, they found a ghost town. There was no one here. They'd all fled. And that's part of what happened in the Mech Deck, what happened with the papers, right, when they stored in the library or the courthouse. Those are all, avenues that you go look, but you realize the whole area was devastated for 2 years of war in the region. The houses are burned down, Jack's Tavern's burned down, the British, there's a revenge rising and Fort Virginia taking everything hands on. And so that, if there were even papers here, they're gone.
Really quickly, I've got one for you guys. Speaking of Jack's Tavern, since we are sitting in a place enjoying some beverages, and Mr. Fleming, as you were talking about, there's kind of a hangover feeling the next day. Can you speak about James Jack's Tavern? And because I'm pretty sure that I've had some nights where me and somebody have been in a tavern long enough that we declared independence as well. Right? So can you speak about some of that? I believe, and here's the sentiment of how was this received, right? Because we were so small as an area at the time compared to the next declaration in America that came out that was very largely united. I believe the Catalonians have been declaring independence from Spain every year. Texas tries to declare independence once a year from America. How seriously was this taken at the time? And were the signers just a few guys that finally had a big enough chest to do this, or was this the sentiment at the time in the state?
I think that they had been, the leaders and the scholars from Princeton had been discussing it for years. And there had been, the whole area, the whole region was in essentially open rebellion. Whether it's the regulators up near Salisbury or the Sugar Creek War that took place in the 1767, something. So they had been thinking about it for a while, and again, what I love is the Charlotteans, they put it in writing. So that's how serious they were. I think everybody was sort of like, we're sick of this, we're not going to put up with this anymore. But God love them, the Mech-Deckers were like, oh, we're going to have receipts. We're going to put it in writing. We've already discussed how it's going to go. And so I don't think it was, I think they were ready, they just needed that spark from Lexington and Concord.
In terms of the hangover concept, there's actually an amazing anecdote that I came across doing another sculpture for Charlotte, Thomas Spratt and King Hagler, which I hope you go visit. But so Spratt is a very established guy in town. He's grew up through his whole life, and he's well known. And he was very much involved in this conversation. But I think Captain Jack was feeding him a lot of alcohol that day. Because sales were good, and Thomas Spratt ended up being so inebriated they didn't know what to do with him, so they put him in the jail. But he was close friends with the Catawba chief who died, so he was pretty much an adopted friend of the Catawbas. And dramatically, it's described as suddenly horses arrive and encircle the courthouse and demand the release of Thomas Pratt from jail, and they broke him out.
We actually have, our core beer is named Spratz after Thomas Pratt, so we definitely took a liking to his affinity for the beers in Mecklenburg.
I mean, it's perfect. And there were, I think, sons of Thomas Polk, who again, in grand Scots-Irish Presbyterian fashion, over-celebrated and could not be used as eyewitnesses because they had blacked out celebrating. But I do think this is what's so cool about what you guys have done with your beer and honoring the Sprats, is there's a connection to sort of this communal get-together, drink, talk about independence, talk about our rights, whether it's declaring it, celebrating it. The main reason they were at the Freedom Spring was that there was a whiskey still there that used the fresh water to create whiskey. So alcohol was sort of part of the discussion and part of the perfect storm that created the MECTEC.
So May 20, 1775 is one of the dates on the North Carolina flag. Somebody put it there, right? And somebody left it there for some reason. And even though these naysayers may dispute it, I'm a little amazed that it's, why is it still there if they don't think it's true? To me, this is like people from California saying that the redwood and the bear on their flag don't exist and they're not really real. But here we are, and what was the reason for putting it on our flag? Do you know? When?
So after the Civil War, the date was, 2 dates were put on the North Carolina state flag after the Civil War: May 20th, 1775, and May 20th, 1861, which was the day the North Carolina seceded from the Union. And that wasn't a coincidence that they picked the same day. You can figure it out. And then they changed the state flag, I believe 1883 or 5, and dropped the 1861 date and replaced it with the Halifax Resolve of April 1776. So it's been on the state flag since 1865. Just going back to Spratt real quick, if you don't know that story, you ought to go see his statue in front of the CPCC Culinary Arts Building of Thomas Spratt and King Angler. He had told me this story when I was working on another book on eminent Charlotte people. And the Spratt story is a great story, and not to get too far afield on it, but he's wounded fighting the British in September at a place called Wahab's Plantation, where they ambush a bunch of Scottish Highlanders the first thing in the morning. He's the only casualty. So you can go find the Spratt graves of the whole family are out at Fort Mill, and they're still there by the side of the road. And I'll read you the inscription. I'm looking at a picture of his gravestone, which has the best possible inscription on that you could ever imagine. So let me see if I can read it. So Thomas Spratt, who died July 21st, 1780, age 76 years. So here's the inscription. In friendship he was ever true, his heart sincere, like him, but few. His blood was spilled in freedom's toil. His blood was spilled in freedom's cause, rather than submit to British laws. Some of that.
I'll add to that one of the things I think is fascinating and very effective are a lot of the signers, the people associated to the MECTEC. I'm not sure if they were worried, but they etched the story of the MECTEC into their gravestones. And some of those gravestones, those stories are some of the best evidence we have. It was a great idea because several of them have survived to this day. And it's impossible, I will add, it's impossible to imagine these men, one of them is a reverend, a historian, a military veteran. It's impossible to imagine someone like that or their families etching a lie onto their gravestone for all eternity. It's impossible.
So when we have the USA 250 celebration next year, will we hear anything about this? And if not, how do we change that?
I do. I get a lot of media requests around July 4th because people want to talk about how that's not actually the day of independence. It's on May 20th is when we really should be celebrating. So I would just encourage people to remind people next year that let's celebrate everything, but this is the wrong day.
I have a submitted question here. Was there any pushback reported from the May 19th and May 20th meetings? And what happened at Captain Jack's delivery of the document in Philadelphia? Then we might have time for 1 or 2 more minutes.
So there's no recorded pushback locally that we know of. And interestingly, you talk about what happened to your papers and so forth, but what happened after the May 1920 resolutions were they governed the county and the region as if they were independent. They actually gathered up all the loyalists of the known Tories and they deported them out of the state. They sent them under guard to Camden. And they governed with a military tribunal for 5 years. And you had to have a piece of paper attested that you were a loyal, patriotic citizen to travel. So it was under military law essentially from May 1775 onwards. So that tells you the mentality they had about what was going on. So Captain Jack, this is the great mystery of the Jack, the denouement of the Jack story, right? All we know about the Jack story, at least from Jack, is his affidavit he does, which is really only about a paragraph and a half. So he went in June of 1775, he went to Philadelphia. He met with 2 of the 3 congressional representatives. But he doesn't say who said what, or what he gave them, or how long he was there, or what they had for dinner, or the reception. So it's like a lot of things in the story. They give you just enough evidence to really hook you, and then nothing else. So we don't really know. Now, the interesting part of that is, and they sent him home as being premature, but the 2 that he met with, which is, I believe, Caswell and Hooper, I may have one of those wrong, are 2 of the most loyalist, sympathizing congressional representatives there were. In fact, after that's part of the controversy later, Jefferson says to Adams, he goes, "You remember as well as I, there was no greater Tory in Congress than Hooper." Well, how's Hooper going to respond if he's handed this declaration and these farmers living in the woods declaring independence? He's like, who are these people? Like, no way we're doing this. So, there's a great conspiratorial line of thought that this is the first original governmental cover-up. This declaration is brought to Congress and the 2 congressional representatives, when it had nothing to do with it, snuff it out. That's all.
Quick question for you guys. What are you guys working on next? Is there a chapter 2 to the mech deck or any more characters coming out?
Yes, when a copy of the original mech deck falls out of someone's family Bible within the next year, I will reissue them. There'll be a special edition of both my book and Scott, as I said, Scott's doing a Cornwallis book that I think comes out next year. Yep, I have a book on an NFL team coming out in October. This is about the last NFL team to fail. But I think this all pales in comparison to probably what you're working on.
Actual projects now? Well, the one that's actually related by family is, and within this year, the statue for North Carolina in Statuary Hall, and the Statuary Hall collection in the Capitol, I got to do, and it's Billy Graham. So that's North Carolina one. There's a chance that there's more North Carolina Revolutionary War pieces. Then, just for me, right now, I watch my hands for coming, working on 4 pieces that are for a building in Dallas that has a theme of the pursuit of happiness. And this came to me, or at least people were asking me questions on this, because the architect is English. And he was trying to convince them that the art in there, to illustrate the concept of pursuit of happiness, should be something derived from Greek mythology. I love Greek mythology, totally. But this is totally an American concept. And so I suggest, gosh golly, maybe we should have American themes in there. And so the figures I've been working on for the past few months and for a while are pioneer figures. So late 1850s to late 1800s. And they cover 4 concepts of the pursuit of happiness that I've devised, and they're different scenes. And the first one is family, the next is faith, and then friendship, and the last one is endeavor.
Wow.
So I've been totally into like the pleats of women's skirts at the time, suspenders, shoes, tools, showing a lot of agrarian stuff. So anyway, that's where my world has been. A little on the very much on the American side, just church. Well, and this is totally tangential now. But I also paint, so I paint portraits and things, and I did if you go visit the White House, the portrait of Barbara Bush. I got to do years ago, and then suddenly I got a heads up from the Postal Service asking if I'd help them with designing a stamp based on that portrait, and that's what was just unveiled last Thursday in the White House for the first time. I told you his answer was going to be way better than ours. He's off subject.
You mentioned Billy Graham. I just wanted to point out when we were talking about Freedom Park and the bicentennial celebration in 1975, which included Gerald Ford hemming and hawing and not really acknowledging the MEC deck, but he was shown up that day by Billy Graham, who did his entire 45-minute speech on the MEC deck and the MEC deck descendants and the signers.
Yeah. And I couldn't tell, I saw that video a while ago, and I couldn't tell if he was actually reading anything.
Yeah, he's off the cuff. Yeah.
He knew the story. I mean, this was really great fun to watch.
So just kind of one last question about the back there. You mentioned Jefferson wasn't a big fan of it. Were there a lot of Jefferson supporters in North Carolina? It was pretty agricultural, kind of the days after. Did that contribute to a lot of the doubt on that?
No, I don't think there were a lot of pro-Jefferson people in North Carolina at that point. No, well, Jefferson, it's interesting. Jefferson has a little more nuance than he gets credit for, because he writes a very reasonable and lengthy letter to Adams in which he basically says, I've not heard of this. None of the historians, that we all know, no one mentioned it, that I, had heard of it either. He points out that there was no greater Tory in Congress than Hooper, which really irritated people in North Carolina at the time. So, but Jefferson says, if more solid proof is produced, then I could believe this, but you can't disprove a negative. And he famously writes, until such evidence is produced, I must be a disbeliever in the apocryphal gospel. But he doesn't say it didn't happen. He just said, I don't have enough evidence here to make a decision about it, which then changes it to, well, Jefferson disproved it. It's been debunked, which is entirely not the case. So.
All right, well, we just have a special guest show up, so I'm going to introduce Kendall Kendrick here. She's got something special to tell us.
Hi everyone. Hello. I have a special hot delivery here that you all might be interested in, straight from the City Council meeting tonight, where the mayor read a joint proclamation declaring this Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence Month. Nice.
It was like Jack showing up, right? Is she on a horse?
It's been a controversial night for the City Council. Yes, I'm crazy.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Tim Gibson. I am the Director of Individual Giving with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library Foundation. And I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation tonight. On behalf of the Library Foundation, I want to thank our panelists, Scott, Chaz, and Dave, and our fantastic moderator, Carrie, for helping guide us through this thoughtful and engaging conversation tonight. So let's give them a hand. A big thank you to Town Brewing and Mark Cutney for partnering with us tonight. And to Brandon for giving us the backstory on the First and Freedom Lager. And of course, thank you to all of you for spending your evening with us and helping us celebrate these 250 years of MECDEC, and for helping us kind of kick off bringing back this final draft series. Hopefully we'll have more of them as we go on. Before we close, I want to share a few upcoming library events.
Oh boy, I'm so grateful that I got to get in on this event. I got in last minute. It started at 6 and I bought my ticket at 5:36. It was sold out, but someone canceled at the last minute and I was on the waiting list for a person to be notified if a ticket got canceled. And I had a really good time. I did not expect to see Chaz Fagan, and I talked a lot about him if you watched my Trail of History video. He did several of those statues. He did the Captain James Jack statue, of course, and he also did the Thomas Spratt and King Hagler statue, which I think are two fantastically well done statues. They're absolutely beautiful, eye-catching, and they've got great locations. I was laughing so hard at his story about trying to figure out how he wanted Captain Jack to be oriented facing north, since that's the direction that he was riding his horse. But to do so, man, he had to put his horse where three lanes or three roads intersect, 3 lanes of traffic intersect, and so all those people would be looking at a horse's butt. So that explains a few things. I have always felt like the horse's orientation was a little odd. It seems like if you rotated it like 180 degrees, it would be a lot more eye-catching and a lot more interesting in the corner where they've actually placed it. But now I understand, and I'm so glad that he told that story. Now I know why the horse is positioned that way. It was great to hear from the other 2 men who were authors, David Fleming and Scott Syfert. They had a really great presentation and told a lot of things I didn't know. I kind of thought I had become a little bit of a MECDEC expert after all the videos I've been working on this month, and there's so much more I had never heard. So many great stories I'd never heard. I never heard about Thomas Spratt getting so drunk he had to get locked up overnight celebrating from signing the MECDEC. It was just a really good time. I hope you're able to enjoy the audio. I'm sorry I don't have any video to go with it, but I feel so lucky. And we got an announcement tonight that the mayor of Charlotte has officially decided to declare May Mecklenburg Declaration Month, which, to be fair, I've already been calling it that for weeks and weeks, so I feel like credit goes to the people who demanded it. But I'm glad to know that, hey, 11 days in, or 12 days in, this is Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence Month. All right, guys, I'm out. I'm going home. I'll see you another day in another MECDEC celebration.